A long time ago now, I had the crazy idea of building my dream car. Inspired by the then new generation World Rally car, I wanted to make my own version. This turned out to be a huge project as I needed to produce a small compact turbocharged car with crazy aero, and after 3 years and the use of 2 cars, I managed to build it. For a total experiment and prototype, it actually worked quite well. Thousands of miles in various tracks and hill climbs later, here we are. However, there has been a small underlying problem that keeps coming up.
Yeah, temperature's getting too high.
The coolant temps get too hot when you really give it some for more than 5 minutes or so, and this is currently stopping me from using it to its full potential. Now it's time we try to get this fixed. And I think I have a plan. First though, I need to go to work.
What's up is down, what's left is right. Chasing stars and holding you. I can't see the end, but I'll see it through. Dangerous times, don't fly too high. Be sure to keep the ground in sight. Fly forever if you keep it tight. Love the world and keep the sky on your mind. Get on board. You get one. We're sailing.
Almost ready for departure.
For those of you who are new to the channel and therefore know nothing about this car, I will quickly run through the current cooling setup. At the front of the car we have very little room. Because of this, the radiator is mounted in the boot. We have coolant lines running from the front of the engine all the way through the car and into the boot, where you can see the radiator is situated. Quite a large aftermarket rad. I don't believe the radiator is the issue. In order to get the water circulating through the car, I have an electric water pump just down behind the passenger seat here. The mechanical water pump in the engine is still in situ, which is workable with an external pump to run in unison, but I believe personally the external water pump and the internal pump are fighting each other, possibly causing turbulence and air in the system. The thermostat is removed altogether. So my plan is to replace the external pump for another Davies Craig unit. However, this one is twice the flow rate of the one that's on the car. In theory, this should be powerful enough to run the whole system and get the water flowing a bit faster, and should allow me to remove the mechanical pump completely. That's internal in the engine. It comes complete with this controller, which will help me regulate the temperature. It has all kinds of settings to get the job done. This is the more heavy duty pump, which I plan just to swap out for the one that's in the car. Hopefully I can leave it in the same position. Before I get this installed, I need to get the front of the car stripped down so I can get to the front of the engine and get to that water pump. There may be a few more bits I want to address under the front here. Then we can start draining the water. We will get the pump installed, and fingers crossed we can sort out this cooling issue.
The first thing I need to do is take the trim and badge away from the top of the front bumper. This will give me access to remove more of the front end. Just 2 Allen head bolts and off it comes.
It's been a while since I took this bumper off, so I'm trying to remember where the bolts are.
Once I remembered how this front bumper was attached, I started drilling out the rivets that hold the front bumper to the front quarter panels. There are about 8 rivets on either side to drill out. They are fairly easy to spot through the vinyl, and I'm making sure I drill the center of the hole so I can get a new rivet in when it comes time to put the front bumper back on. Some of the vinyl is overlapped between the two panels. I carefully use a Stanley knife and cut down the seam. One more rivet needs to come out that I forgot about, and that side is separated. I repeat the exact same process on the other side, and whilst doing that I realised I need to take the wheels off. This is to gain access to the screws that connect the arch liner to the front bumper, but we'll get to that in a minute. With a couple more rivets to attend to on the front bumper, I then start tackling the underside, removing the bolts that hold the protectors on underneath, which are connected to the arch liner. We are just left with 2 small bolts that hold the front bumper on to the crash bar. Now the bumper should be ready to come off. Well, almost ready to come off.
We're still attached. I just need to take the cold air duct off, and we should have the bumper clean off. Yes. Now the front bumper's off, we can get to the intercooler, which is in the way of the front of the engine, so we'll get this removed.
I start by removing the bolts from the mounts at the top. These are small 13mm bolts, easy to get to. Then I start tackling the intercooler pipes themselves by removing the hose clamps. There should just be enough wiggle room to pull the intercooler out without moving the pipes themselves. On the offside, I have to remove the cold air duct in order to get to the hose clamp on the pipe, but that's just as simple as removing another 13mm on the chassis leg. Once I remove both, the intercooler's free. By pushing the clips out the way, this should give me more wiggle room. As I remove the intercooler, I check for debris. I check for any damage. To be honest, apart from a bit of surface dirt, it's still in very good condition.
I want to get this oil pressure gauge installed. To make this job easier, I'm going to take off the alternator, which will allow me to get access to the port for the sensor. Then I can get the crank pulley off, timing belt cover off, then we should have access to the water pump.
Starting by pulling the power steering hoses out the way, I slacken off the alternator. Now I can move on to release the belt, making it loose enough. It's still not quite loose enough. There we go, we got the belt off. Before I can remove the alternator, I need to remove the power supply from the battery. Then I pull the long bolt out the top, remove the tensioner bolt, which allows me to pull the alternator out completely. I could then get easy access to the voltage meter, the green plug, which I'm sure I did, but didn't film. Instead of making a tool to hold the crank pulley in place, or even buying one from Subaru for that matter, I decided to use the slightly sketchy belt locking technique. Sometimes you can do this without damaging the belt, other times you're not so lucky. To save time, I decided to take the risk. You can see the belt is simply tucked into itself on the left top side of the pulley. This simply locks it into place as I turn the bolts, and it's as simple as that. I could then fully remove the bolts and pull off the pulley, allowing me access to the timing belt covers. There are a series of 12mm bolts all the way around the exterior, which I'm going around and removing. The coolant lines are tucked away close to the timing cover on the near side, but with a bit of perseverance, it comes off. There's always one that gets left behind. Off comes the center cover. This now gives me access to the area I need to get to for the water pump.
Before I take the pump off, I need to drain the water from the engine.
On a traditional Subaru, at this point you just take out the drain plug from the radiator itself. However, on this setup, I need to unbolt the thermostat housing, which is the part I'm removing now. Simply 2 10mm bolts. As the water starts draining out, I'm looking for debris, any bits, any data or signs that would indicate to me the health of the engine, the water pump. It all helps and encourages preventative maintenance if need be.
I'm going to remove the tensioner so we can get the belt off the water pump, which is this unit here, and we will probably have to remove this pulley too.
By cracking and slacking off the main bolt that holds the tensioner on, this will allow me to get the tensioner removed by taking the pressure off the timing belt. It's important to remember that we are dealing with the timing belt, and therefore all 4 camshafts and crank sprocket are in set positions. As I'm working, I need to be careful not to lose the timing. With the tension released, I can carefully get the pulley prised up. Prying the pulley up and releasing the tension allows me to get to the next step.
I have just locked out the tensioner by threading a small Allen key through the pin at the top.
With the tensioner fully locked, I can remove it completely. As I do, I make sure I keep the timing on the crank pulley by wedging the belt between the casing and the pulley. You can see there the Allen key locking the hydraulic tensioner into place. That will stay in until the part goes back on. I'm now removing the idler pulley that's bolted to the water pump housing. This is currently in the way of some of the bolts I need to get to in order to remove the water pump.
With the timing belt out the way, I have removed the bypass pipe, and now I just need to remove it.
As I remove the water pump, I'm extremely careful with the bolts that hold it to the engine. They are notorious for snapping or cross-threading in the aluminium block. At this stage, it's well worth taking the time to make sure it's done right. With all the bolts cracked off, I can now save a bit of time and use the gun to whip them out the block. With a bit of prying from a screwdriver, it soon comes off. It now just needs to carefully be removed from behind the cam guard.
There we have it. The water pump is off.
On to the next job.
With the water pump removed from the car, the first real challenge is going to be trying to remove this impeller. It's connected directly to the pulley. It's certainly not as simple as just removing a bolt, so I'm going to use a core drill and see if I can take off the majority of the impeller.
As I can't see exactly what's going on behind the impeller, it will just be a stroke of luck if this works. I'm not sure how thick this impeller is going to be. I'm just going to take it steady, making sure I don't blunt the core drill. Less than a couple of minutes later, we had success.
There we go.
The impeller came off nice and central, meaning the shaft that's connected to the pulley that remains internal shouldn't vibrate too much.
Is that a good clean up?
However, the job's not quite done yet. Before I can get this back on the car, I need to make sure there is no debris or metal left inside the pump housing. I will deburr the area that I've drilled out, clean off the old dried silicone sealant, making sure I don't damage the fragile gasket that sits between this and the engine. Once it's all had a final clean, I can now get some fresh sealant back on. I like using this Hylamar stuff. It's specific for sealing water components, and in the past it's worked wonders.
It's good stuff, that. Stinks though.
On reinstalling the pump, I have to get this right. I need to twist it and lift it into place, making sure I don't catch it on anything and therefore messing up all the sealant that I've just applied. A steady hand is really needed now. Full concentration, we should be alright. With it lined up, I quickly get a bolt just to secure it into place, starting by doing them all up finger tight. Once they're all in, I make sure not to over tighten them, around 15 Newton meters I think from memory, and it's that simple, it's back on. That's the mechanical water pump deleted.
Next I'll get the tensioner back on, along with the pulley that came off the water pump.
As the timing belt hasn't moved, this pulley could be quite tricky to get on, as there will be tension on the belt as I start threading the nut into the housing. I fight with it for a while, and eventually I decide to slip the belt off the idler on the left. Once I did that, it went on easy. I quickly move on to the tensioner. Remember, it's still locked off at this point, so it's quite easy to get back on the engine. I bolt it up tight, making sure I'm happy it's seated right. Then I slacken the bolt back off a couple of times. I now need to pull that small Allen key back out, which will release the tensioner pin. This will allow the belt to tension back up automatically. All I need to do is make sure the tensioner pin is seated properly on its mounting point at the top. I run my hand around the belt in multiple places, making sure the tension's okay. Once I'm happy, then I can lock the tensioner in place.
I'm pretty happy with the tension on the belt. All of the timing marks are still in line. The crank pulley's been locked the entire time, so I can do the tensioner up. And the torque spec for that one as well is 39 Newton meters for both.
That's the idler pulley done up, followed by the tensioner. With the belt and pulleys in place, I give the timing covers a quick clean up, and we can start to get them back on, starting with the central one. Once I'm doing that, I can hear some help arrive. It sounds like my two apprentice nieces. They've seen the car a lot on YouTube, but let's see how they get on actually working on the car.
Make sure it's in place. Give it a good wiggle around. Give it a bash, maybe punch it a few times.
You have to make sure that
Your eyes still filming it?
I am videoing it.
Is it on properly? Oh no.
We've not done it right. We've got to start again.
I found a spot in the middle of the
No, it's not on. That's right. It's on.
Is it? Ah, sweet. Okay.
Well done, Fred.
Nice.
Good work. I can speed it up probably. So going from the top. There you go. You're gonna get to it. There you go. Wind it in. Yep.
Oh, that had a cable tie through it. Do you want to use the tool?
I use the toe.
So you put it in there. No.
Oh yeah,
Wrong
right.
end.
It's going to be on the bloopers.
That'll be a good clip.
Try and get it on straight so it's in line. That's it. That's good. Yeah.
Hot.
Excellent.
Where do you think? No flaps there, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Got it?
I'm to do it up tight.
Right, we've got the timing covers back on. We've got the crank pulley torqued up to 100 Newton meters. Next, we're going to install the oil pressure sensor.
Jiggy majigger, what's that?
I help.
So we need to take the OEM sensor out the engine there.
Mama.
Yeah.
Wasn't very tight, no?
You're not supposed to overdo them. Nice.
What happens if I licked my hands?
Do you guys want to open this? Oh, thanks. It's a very nice gift.
This?
Yeah.
Let's tip it out. What's that?
Flame cake!
No. Careful with the slinky, alright?
This is
That's quite important,
This is something that means to go on a fridge.
No, it's not going to go on a fridge.
After a short while, the junior mechanics got bored, leaving just me and my brother to install this gauge. We first find the right adapter that we can screw straight into the OE port. Before he threads it in, I put a small bead of sealant on the threads, just in case of any leaks when the oil gets really hot. As it's in a really tight place and hard to get to, it makes sense to eliminate any possibility of a leak. Next, we get the newly named Slinky installed. The tube simply screws into the adapter we've already installed. After a quick nip of the 10mm, that part is done, and maybe a nip for good luck. To seal up the engine fully, I need to get the bottom water hose installed back on the car. This is sealed into place by some fresh sealant and the gutted thermostat housing that holds the rubber seal. That will be plenty to seal it off. With the 210 bolts nipped up, I just need to let the sealant dry.
Before I can get the new water pump installed, I first need to take the passenger seat out.
Putting all of these components in a small Peugeot body shell and mounting them as low as possible in the car for better handling and weight distribution. It does mean they are in awkward places. To work in the area where I need to replace the water pump is right behind the passenger seat, so this has to come out, and I'll be climbing in and out of the car through the roll cage. Being well over 6 foot is not ideal for this sort of job, but hey, I was the one that installed the cage, so I can only blame myself. Once I pull the belts out of the way and get the padding out, and of course remove the bolts from the side mounts, I can pull the seat out the car. This allows access to remove the cover for both the fuel and water pump. This opens things right up, and I can start pulling parts off. I can first remove the aluminium mount that I made for the original pump. The new pump is mounted differently, so I don't need to use that one. Referring to the manual, the correct orientation for this pump for bleeding is something like that sort of angle with the outlet on the top. Therefore, I can put it in the same position as the old pump. I unplug the power supply, drain the water, catching as much as I can. I then reposition the pump to remove the hose from the other side, and surprisingly it all came off without a huge mess. I need to utilise some of the parts from the old setup and proceed to remove the hose clamps. I did buy some new adapters going from 32mm to 38mm. In fact, I can use the old one. I prefer using this type over staggered barbs as it doesn't have a definitive lip on it. I will revert to the old ones. With the plan in motion, I remove the other old adapter that I'm going to use. Then I mark out where I need to cut the new hose to fit onto the new pump and the new setup. With a sharp knife, I carefully cut around the edge of the tape, which is my reference line, all the way around until it's clean off.
Perfection.
I fit the new old adapter, which I can clamp into place. This is going to be the inlet side to the pump, and I can get the silicone hose installed on that inlet on the pump now. I will just fit it loosely so I can twist the pipe to create the best angles and orientation once it goes in the car for the least amount of twist and stress on the silicone hose. This will be the outlet side, again using the old adapter. Once that is all clamped up into place, I can fit it to the pump and then get the pump back in the car.
3, 2, 1. It's in! Almost exactly the same place as the old pump. In true race car fashion, I will just cable tie it to the roll cage and put some padding in between the pump and the tube. As per instructions, I need to use the temp sensor they gave me in this kit. That means I need to remove the ducting from the boot so I can get to and replace the sensor.
Just a couple of M6 Allen head bolts to pull this shroud out. It honestly took longer to find a place to put it down as I'm very limited for space in this tent. We now have access to that temp sensor.
I take that back, I forgot it's a large 22mm sensor, meaning this one will not fit. Therefore, I will need to use this inline adapter, and I think I'll put it just pre-water pump. That will mean I can monitor the temperature of the water after it's come through the rad.
It's not the end of the world, but it does mean a bit more modification to my new setup. I get the hose back off the pump where I'm going to install this sensor, using the same tape marker technique to get a nice accurate cut. Using the hose clamp supplied in the kit, I can secure the part in line before I wind the sensor into the block. You guessed it, I'm going to put a bit of sealant on the threads, and definitely making sure not to do it up too tight as it's a brass fitting going into plastic threads. It could be a disaster. Same goes for the blanking screw. A quick bit of sealant and wind it in.
It should be in for the final time now. Got the sensor and the blank installed. All the hose clamps are done up. The pump is in a good orientation. The next thing to do, I have the wiring out. I need to do a couple of modifications to make it best suited for the car. What I'll do is I'll get it installed, then I'll run through what I've done to make it work, and I'll let you know if there are any installation issues along the way.
First off, I know for a fact I need a larger ring connector on the earth wire, as I already have a place in mind where I'm going to bolt it onto the car. Once inside the car, I could connect the power to the pump, install the plug for the temperature sensor.
I have power to the controller along with the earth. I will plug it in and see what we've got. Oh shit, water pump's on, which I don't want because there's no water in it. I shouldn't run the pump dry, so I'll get some water in the system. I put some coolant in via the pipes from the rad. Hopefully there's some sat down in the pump now. Okay, power on. I can hear it circulating. It's cut out. I have no idea what I'm doing, to be quite honest. Yeah, I'll refer to the instructions and we'll go from there. We've got good battery voltage anyway. Okay, it might need more water. I have managed to figure out that the pump is currently in pulse mode. This means I need to get the car running so I can get some heat into the engine, and then hopefully it will start to run continuously once we get warmth into the water. This means I need to get the alternator installed. That's the only thing stopping me running the car, apart from quickly installing the intercooler. But first I do want to replace the power steering pipe that runs along this section here. The rest of the bits I'm going to replace I can get to from the top. I have just realised I do not have the adapter for this pipe, so I cannot connect it on the bottle side. I'm gonna have to wait on this job, but one job I can do is get the alternator on. Before going back on, every step is in reverse. I plug in the green connector, slide the alternator down into the gap, install the long bolt and nut on the top side. After getting away with not damaging the belt during the previous shenanigans, I could get that installed. Along with the tensioner bolts, I can start adjusting the belt tension. It takes a minute or two before I'm happy with the tension. As a general rule, I try to twist the belt vertically. If with a reasonable amount of force I can do that, I think it's somewhere near. Once I'm happy, I lock off the bolt to the adjuster on the lower side. This locks it all into place and it's not going anywhere. We're still not quite done with the alternator. I have to install the charging wire back onto the top, and that should be the charging for the battery. Good to go. I now have the delightful task of routing the slinky into the car. This is of course the feed for the oil pressure gauge. This copper tube needs to be routed around the side of the engine bay and directed through the firewall somewhere. I will take the same route as I did for the water temperature gauge plumbing, which is somewhere on the opposite side to the turbo. Once I straighten out the slinky a little bit, I can find the best route along the underside of the scuttle panel. I need to make sure it's nowhere near the windscreen wiper mechanism, as that could severely damage the tube. Bit of guesswork involved. I have spent a bit of time making this bracket and mount for the oil pressure gauge. It will also house the water temp gauge. I'm going to get some black paint on it, then I'll show you how I'm going to install it. In the meantime, whilst that paint is drying, I'll modify the top power steering line. You can see these choke points where I've had issues before. Power steering is a bit notchy at lower speed, especially this one over here.
I like this one.
I think the issue I'm having with the power steering is you see how that pipe is warmed up. There's a kink in it. It's leaking slightly. Hopefully it holds on. I have some 135-degree hoses, which I'm hoping are going to cure this problem. This particular part of the engine bay I've never been particularly happy with. At the time of putting the car together, I used the existing parts I had from the original engine, cobbling them together the best I could, but it has always been on the back burner to get this job done right, so I'm excited to do this. I remove the hose from the power steering pump and direct the fluid into a tub, trying to avoid to get any on the exhaust. I then pull up the bottle and try and get as much as the fluid out. Next, I carefully consider where to cut this hose. I want to give as much clearance from the front cross member as possible, as I always have to consider the movement and vibration of the engine, wanting to avoid any chafing or wearing through of the hose, so it's worth getting this bit right. I'm afraid the scissors aren't quite cutting it for this one. The craft knife, however, has no issues. How good is that? I'm now moving on to the other end, where I'm going to put the second 135-degree hose. This side I have even less room. Once I drain a bit more fluid, I pull the pipe off, trim the hose down and test it on the bottle. So far it's looking pretty good. Now the task is to join these two pipes up. I decide to use part of the hose from the old setup, and I need to use the joiners for both ends also. Here I can't just guess and cut the pipe down to the length I think it needs to be. I need to get the one side installed, route it through where it needs to go on the car, then I can mark out where it needs to be trimmed down to. With it tested in place, I can now trim it down. All I need to do is get the adapter on, and then it can be all joined up. What's up? How's it going? Yeah, good. How are you getting on? Yeah. We'll go in your car if you want. As long as you can handle the power, mate. Yeah. I'll try. Yeah, see you in a bit. Alright, bye. Well, we're certainly not going in the Peugaru, that's for sure. Not at this rate. It's now a million times better than it was, even though it's still quite tight. The fact that the pipe is formed, it's not going to kink. So overall, a shorter pipe, which obviously will help with the weight, less fluid, less tube, every little helps. Keen to get this job done and get the car out and tested. I am going to press on with the other hose. I did want to wait for the correct adapter to come in the post, but it could be at least 10 days, so I'm hoping I can just use what I've got. I need to take the air intake out to get to one side of this hose, so we're pressing on with that. Hose clamp released, remove
remove the airflow sensor and off it comes.
You can now see why I want to replace this pipe. It's slightly oversized. It has leaked slightly in the past. Unfortunately, I don't have a joiner. My plan is just to force the new hose onto the connector and just hope for the best.
As I start removing all 3 of those hose clamps, I make sure no fluid has dripped down onto the coil pack wiring. Needless to say, this could cause some running issues or a potential fire even. I have had a coil pack go down on me already, so I'm going to make sure it's nice and clean before I put it back together.
Now that I'm back in my civvies, I can't do any mucky jobs, so unfortunately the remaining power steering hose has to wait. However, I can install the oil pressure gauge, which I'll have a go at right now. Marginally cleaner in here. Basically, I'm going to connect the gauge with the tube I threaded through the bulkhead.
I wind the correct adapter onto the back of the gauge. This will allow me then to wind the hose directly onto that.
A very simple bracket. I've painted it matte black. The way the gauges are secured, I'm simply going to cable tie them into place. Allows for quick removal, easy access. The fact it's only half mounted, it means I can drop the gauge straight out rather than take a whole panel off. So there are a lot of upsides. As I say, simple, quick and easy.
With both gauges flush and leveled off, I get to the holder mounted underneath the dashboard, just using 2 rivets to mount it. It took a moment or 2 to get the holes lined up.
My eye line, good visibility. Back from the pub now, probably not a good idea to do any more work on the old car, so we'll carry on putting the front end back together tomorrow.
The next morning, feeling fresh as a daisy, and with my oily rags back on, I could continue with the power steering hose on the lower side. I pull the old hose off, cut the new hose to the same length, install it onto the top side. I only need 1 Jubilee clip there now, as the pipe actually fits tight, and on the lower side, it actually pushed onto the adapter quite easily, so I'm happy with the fact I didn't have to wait for the new adapter.
These are the sorts of jobs that take time on custom build projects like this. You can't just go to the shop, buy a hose and expect it to fit. You can spend hours just doing the simplest of jobs, replacing hoses, but the good thing, you tend to improve the setup a bit each time you do it.
With the area checked and clean, I get the air intake back on the car. Then my attention is on getting the tube for the oil pressure gauge installed nicely. Taking a moment to think about the most suitable way it's going to go. Deciding to trace the wiring up the frame on the offside. Using small cable ties along the way. Progress is good and I can get the intercooler back on. It takes a little while to wiggle everything into place as it's all so tightly packed underneath the front bumper. It's bolted into place on the lower mounts. Then I move to the 2 points on the top. I can do the clamps up on the joiners from the intercooler to the pipes, followed by bolting the cold air intake to the chassis leg. This is all tucked behind the bumper, so I need to get to it now.
I'm going to hold off from putting the front bumper on until I've ran the car up. We have taken a fair few parts off, and until I'm happy it's all set and there are no leaks, I will leave the front end exposed.
Before I start the car, I go through the essential checklist. I top up the power steering fluid.
The moment of truth, it's start-up time. I'm going to try not to set fire to the bumper. Just twisting the pump into its optimal bleeding position as per instructions. Currently still 24 degrees. I've just ran the car for 5 minutes or so, maybe a bit longer. I've quickly shut it off as the temperature was getting a bit too hot. Understandably, the water at the top hose coming from the engine is really, really hot. Ow. So is this. It's quite warm all the way down into the car. It's kind of lukewarm there. It's room temperature here and it does feel like I've got an airlock, and the return hose is cold. The controller was reading 24 degrees the entire time. Still have an air leak somewhere, and therefore the pump is still not doing its job. I will let the car cool down fully, then I can try and get some more water in the back end before we run it again. For my next attempt at bleeding the cooling system, I will just run the pump on ignition. I have disconnected the bottom hose and extended the one side into a container. The other side that feeds to the pump, I'm just going to fill until I get a constant flow. Then the plan is to quickly rejoin the hose and bleed the small amount of air that will be left in the system. By doing this though, I can constantly feed the pump until it has enough force to push the water all the way through the system. At least that's the plan.
Once I turn the ignition on, the pump will fire up. So I need to get the water in as quickly as I can. You can see the coolant quickly starts coming out the other end, which is a good sign, but it's not a huge amount of flow yet. Once I run out of water, I run round and turn the ignition back off, then I rinse and repeat.
I've done the same procedure a few times now. I've got a steady flow coming out. I'll cram as much water in as I can before I join them back together, and then we'll go for another starter.
Topping up the hose will ensure that the pump has some water to start with to get things moving. Once I'm convinced that's the maximum amount I can fit in, I then move on to the other side. Once I had joined this pipe back together, I could get the engine running. Once again, I walk around the car, checking the temperature of the water at various points, starting at the top hose on the engine, which will be the quickest part to warm up. Then I work my way back along the return line, checking constantly that there's flow through the pump.
The temperature's going up.
way more than it did yesterday, so good sign. You see the temperature on the manual gauge, which is obviously at the front of the engine, is very similar to the temperature here, which means that the water is clearly circulating constantly, which is a brilliant sign. We've got heat in that bottom hose, heat in the top hose. That's good news. Now we're getting some temp in the oil pressure's starting to drop. I will wait for it to get to around 70 degrees and then I'll start the fan up. Right, I'll go for the fan.
You see the fan symbol starts moving, guess what? That means the fan is in operation, so it's working.
It was on 65 going down. I'm not sure if that means a bad thing or not, but error messages do come up at the bottom side. Anyway, I'm happy for the static test. That was a success. With everything tested and working, I can now finish off some of the wiring, tidy that up, including the wires that go to the sensor, the pump. Then I can think about where to mount this controller. Here is quite a good option, and I need to secure the pump.
Now I know the new setup is working, I can finish off the wiring, heat shrinking the connectors, ensuring they're fully insulated. Then I get the rear quarter panel ducting guided back down to the floor pan. This creates a flow of cold air that goes underneath the radiator, which is then in turn drawn through and out the back of the car via the fan. I get to the mounting bracket clipped onto the controller, then put a couple of cable ties through that, which I can thread around this aluminium mount conveniently in place. Do the cable ties up tight, then clip the plug back into the controller. I get the relay cover in place, followed by the pumps cover. Then comes my favourite job in the world, getting the passenger seat in. It's a bit tricky getting all the bolts in, especially with the water lines running on the one side and the wiring down the centre. With the last seat bolt done up, I can thread the harnesses back through the seats, making sure the shoulder straps aren't twisted. That goes for the lap belts too. I slot the fire extinguisher back in, and that's the interior just about complete. Then I move to the back and get the ducting installed. 1 bolt, 2 bolts, done. Moving back to the front of the car, I can put the biggest panel back on, the front bumper. After installing the ram air pipe and making a fool of myself, I wiggle it into place. Surprisingly, it didn't take long to get most of the rivets in. One either side under the headlights, another pair around the top of the light to keep the bumper nice and tight to the headlights. Then I work the areas that join the front bumper to the wings. Unfortunately, the rivets are now exposed, whereas before I wrapped the car after I put the bumpers on, meaning the vinyl covered all of the rivets. I now have more of an aerospace look. In order to tie things together, I install the front grille and badge. It has to be prized underneath the top of the front bumper and under the lights. A couple more screws and it's in place. I join the arch liner to the front bumper. There are a couple of bolts on either side, a rivet or two up on the inside, and 2 bolts that mount to the chassis at the front. The freshly cleaned wheels can go back on, and we're just about there.
I will drop the car back down on the ground. We'll get these wheels torqued up, then we'll go for a test drive.
horsepower here. The first time since the car's been built that I'm putting this E10 through. See how it goes on this stuff. I've tested the car at speed. It's all good and well that the car is keeping cool as I'm driving along, the air's flowing through it. We're happy with that. However, when you're at a track day, you'll often be queuing to get on or off the track, so you'll be stationary, the fan will be going, the car will be super hot, the brakes will be warm. Now we have the heating for the car, so I'll try and do that the best I can in the real world. Okay so far, temperature's okay, but they need to hurry up. Hiya, can I order a Whopper burger meal?
Yeah, get that regular large meal.
Regular, please.
And drink?
And can I just get a Whopper burger on its own?
A Whopper on its own?
Yeah.
You don't want it as a meal?
Not as a meal, so one Whopper meal and then just one burger as well. Sorry? No, that's it. Okay, thank you very much. Onwards. We haven't overheated yet. Right around here. Food, they said. At least this is simulating a good traffic jam or queue. Thank you. Thank you. No cup holders. Thank you. I was just driving home and I noticed the temperature crept up on the gauge that's plumbed in there on the engine, and yes, sure enough, it's overheated, so that's not good.